Greetings, I'm Chad Lavoie, Director of Support for HAProxy Technologies. Today I'm going to be talking about the HAProxy Data Plane API, specifically the latest updates to the Data Plane API. Squirrels dressed as me have presented on this a couple of times, originally in the 2019 in-person conference, and there have been a couple of webinars since then where I've talked about the individual new features. If you've seen all of those things, then you've seen everything that's already going to be in this presentation. However, if you're either new to the Data Plane API or you saw the Data Plane API originally and are waiting to see what new features come along, then this presentation is certainly for you. So without further ado, let us get started with the usual introduction to the Data Plane API. The Data Plane API is a daemon written in Golang, which runs on an HAProxy server and reads and writes to the HAProxy configuration file based upon RESTful API calls that it receives. This might be a little bit easier explained with a diagram, so here we have one. We can see that the client is talking to the API, which has a configuration library, which can parse actual human-written HAProxy configurations and then apply the required changes. So if you want to add a backend server, for example, you tell the Data Plane API the server name and server IP that you want to add, and it will write the change to the configuration and reload HAProxy. If you instead change a server address or weight or change an ACL map file or that kind of thing, it will write the change to the disk, and then it will use the socket to make the change instead of reloading HAProxy. So it will minimize reloads whenever possible. At the same time, it is watching the configuration with iNotify, which is one of the new features added fairly recently, so that if you make a manual change to the configuration, it will be updated in the Data Plane API's memory. And of course, when you start the Data Plane API, it'll read from the disk as well. So you can use the Data Plane API to make modifications which make more sense to be automated, like adding a new front-end and back-end for a self-provisioning system or changing the server IP addresses for a back-end. And then you can manually make configuration changes, like if you want to go in and add rate limiting, for example. You can certainly do that with the the Data Plane API rather, which allows you to make raw configs, but it makes more sense to type it in. It's what you're used to. The Data Plane API will certainly work with you on that regard. So before we get into exactly how to install the Data Plane API, I'm going to jump out of these slides because I hate slides. And I'm going to go over and briefly mention the blog posts for the Data Plane API. So we have a couple, basically every new release of the Data Plane API, we have a new blog post which covers the individual features. So here we can see the AWS service discovery that I'll be mentioning later, the configuration file method, and you can see the syntax for writing things into the configuration file instead of running on the command line that I'll also mention in a minute. And you can see basically specific technical details for all of these various features. That's 2.3, and we have the same thing for 2.4. So basically, if you're looking for how to use a particular new feature, looking at our blog posts is generally a good place to start because we have a lot of details on exactly how each new feature works. The blogs are also generally good for a lot of different things. For example, we have blog posts on rate limiting and how to do that. We have blog posts on bot protection, using the Kubernetes ingress controller. All sorts of fancy stuff is covered there. So I would recommend checking that out at some point if you are interested. So for the moment, let us go back to the slide deck here. And we'll cover installation. So to install it, we have a nice install guide here. The installation process is not terribly interesting. You just do an either apt-get or yum install for enterprise users, and for the open source, you clone the Git repo and make the Golang program, but relatively straightforward either way. Then you add a user list, so you define the usernames and passwords that are allowed to talk to the Data Plane API. Now, with modern versions, you'll usually put it into the HCL file, so you don't have to put it in the HAProxy configuration. However, you can also put the usernames and passwords into the user list in the HAProxy configuration if you so desire. Either way, they work the same. And then you start the Data Plane API. This is the new format to start it. You just give it an HCL or YAML file, and it will read the configuration settings, like where the configuration file is and the service name to start, reload, HAProxy, all that fun stuff. You can, if you want, use the traditional command line parameters to specify all of these various things and the ports on listen on if you want to. So the old method is no longer disabled, but this is the usual method now. And it makes it cleaner if you are using the program section in the HAProxy configuration, which is the normal way to start it. So HAProxy deals with starting the Data Plane API, reloading it itself. It's nice and clean to have this in the configuration and keep the Data Plane API specific configurations in its own file. And then once you're done with that, you visit the IP import you've configured for the Data Plane API to listen on, and /v2/docs, and it will show the docs page. Because I, again, like to show things that are not slides, I will show this here, and it will load up all of the various endpoints that you can hit on the API. And once this comes up, we will be able to type in what we want to search for. In this case, if I want to do a raw configuration, I can click on raw, and I can see that we can push a new configuration using the raw endpoint. If I specify the configuration as a text plain string, and I can specify these query parameters. If I go to my terminal, I can show doing just that. So as an example, if I try it right now, I'll see that the request is forbidden because I added a HTTP deny rule for demonstration purposes. If I go and run this curl command, which has the username and password that is being requested, or that is in the user list to authorize it, post request, text plain content type, data binary, so it doesn't doesn't encode my new lines in the configuration and the new configuration I want, and then the V2 services configuration raw that we can see in the upper right-hand corner of the configuration. Then it will update the config. I also have skip version equals true. As we can see from this, so if you skip version, it will ignore the version check, so we don't need to specify the version of the existing config because I'm blowing it away, and in this case I don't care. And force reload equals true. It means that HAProxy will be reloaded immediately upon when I do this. Otherwise, it will wait for the config reload delay configured in the HCL file to do that. So I press enter and I get the configuration back that it set. And if I run the same curl again, I can see that it correctly returns the backend response. So with that done, let us go back to the slide deck and I will continue on. So here we can see basically the method for building the request. It's what I've basically already covered. You look up what you want to do by searching for it. Either if you want to update a map file, you can type in map. If you want to update it or upload an SSL certificate, you can type in SSL. And you can find out the arguments required to do so by looking in the middle. You can see the query parameters, which go on the URL, and the request body parameters. And then you can see an example of what that looks like with a URL example on the right-hand side of the page. So we can make a request for curl. In this case, it'll return front ends, and you get the response back in JSON if you want to read from the config. Nice and simple. And if instead you want to make a modification, you get the version number. Otherwise, if you don't want to get the version number, you can use the transaction endpoints. So you can start a transaction, get a transaction ID, and then use the transaction ID for things like this, and then commit the transaction with another call that all does basically the same thing. Just if transactions make more sense if you're doing a full set of things like adding a new front end, adding a new back end, adding binds to the front end, servers to the back end, rather than if you're making individual one-off changes like changing a server's address or something, you would just do that using version equals, but either way, it avoids various multiple changes clobbering each other. And then you make the request. It's pretty much exactly the same as what I showed in my lab environment. In this case, I have full JSON here, and the content type is application JSON. And this is more representative of what the majority of the API requests look like. The configuration raw endpoint is fairly unique in that it takes raw data, but you'll see there are other ones like that, like the SSL certificate uploads and map uploads and that type of thing. So with that said, let us go on to the some of the new features in the Data Plane API. So we have one of the big new features that have been added to the Data Plane API recently is the ability to handle dynamic backends. We've had the Consul support where you can register a Consul server with the Data Plane API for quite a while. But we've added a couple of new automatic resolution options similar to the Consul server support here. So for EC2, you can tag an EC2 instance with a server name and server port, and then set up the querying with the API by calling the V2 Service Discovery AWS endpoint. It has a few arguments. You have to either give it the API key and secret, or if you're running this inside of a AMI that already is configured, already authenticated to the AWS API, then you can just make the call without those secrets. And then once you've done that, the backends will appear as AWS region, discovery name, service name, and port. So when you add a new instance, it will add it to the service. And if you add a new name, you can, like a new database or something, then it will create a entirely new backend. Similar to Consul, you can set the scaling parameters so that if you, it will pre-provision blank servers so that when you add more servers to it, it will not trigger a reload unless it absolutely has to. And if it does that too frequently, you can tell it to provision 10 new servers every time it runs out of server slots, for example. And once you've done this API call, it will write the information like the API key and the fact that it isn't talking to AWS to the HCL file or YAML file that the Data Plane API is configured with, in order to automatically resume this operation when you start it. That does also mean that if you didn't want to make the service discovery AWS call at all, you can manually rewrite the AWS or Consul information into the HCL file. And the syntax for doing that is in the blog, but either way, it does the same thing. So we have this, and it shows the various parameters. Again, you can just enter EC2 in the search of the V2 docs if you want to know exactly what is required and what is allowed for that. This is the console that I talked about before. It's not quite as new as AWS, but it is still fairly useful, and it has the same basic parameters as AWS, so I'm not going to go into any exhaustive level of detail about it. However, we have a whitelist and blacklist to include or exclude, either explicitly list what you want to include from Consul or blacklist to not include some things if you have other features on the AWS or the Consul service. If you're using Consul, you have other options as well from this. You can have Consul export a DNS record, and it will respond to DNS SRV records, and you can configure you can just put the DNS name into HAProxy with a resolver section, and you can just have HAProxy automatically do DNS resolutions and get the information from Consul that way. But you can also do it via the API if you want to. Multiple options depending on what works best for your environment. And again, you can go to V2 Docs and search for Consul, and you get the details for exactly how to perform that operation. Then that's everything that I have to talk about today. There are certainly a lot of smaller features that I didn't particularly think of as notable. So if you do want to see the full list, the listing here, we can see there's more logging on the API. There's there's support for more runtime API commands, like the ability to change ACLs. So if you're doing rate limiting, for example, and you have a external script which is watching the backend server load or something, and you want to trigger the enabling of a deny or a JavaScript challenge of or tar pitting of requests if the load is too high, or if it detects that a given client IP is performing web scraping or a login attack, you can have the API add or enable or disable the actual blocking, but you can keep tracking on all the time. And you can just do that with the API. There were other methods for doing that before, like a stick table or map file rather, that you would edit with runtime commands or directives, but gives you new options, support for more keywords, lots of little things. Regardless, that is everything for today, and I hope you found this informative. If you have any questions, I will be here live to talk to you about them, and unleash squirrels on anyone who asks me uncomfortable questions. Thank you. Bye.
Excellent. It was great to hear those updates. And we have Chad Lavoie joining us here live. Thanks for joining, Chad.
Hi, thank you.
Great. So we did get some questions that came in. As a reminder, you can submit questions in the general chat and also on social media, #HAProxyConf. So the first question we have for Chad: the new features in the Data Plane API include adding backends dynamically through service discovery for both AWS EC2 and Consul. For those who aren't familiar with it, can you describe why someone would want to use service discovery in the first place?
So the general reason you'd want to use service discovery is that you have a list of backends that change by something other than HAProxy. That could be that you just want to be able to spin up instances in AWS and have them automatically register themselves without having to do anything further with the HAProxy configuration, or if you already are using Consul for service discovery, or you just want to be able to automatically auto scale your backends by adding a new instance. You can just start it up, it registers itself with Consul, it adds itself to HAProxy, and you don't need to manually modify the configuration. So basically, anytime that either a human or an automated process wants to add or remove backends, and you don't want to have to manually make any calls to HAProxy or the Data Plane API in order to change the backends.
Sure. Great. The next question we have is service discovery adds the backend and servers. Is it also possible to add a front end using the API?
Yes, there's a front end API call. The only interesting thing about it is that the adding a front end does not add any binds to it. So there's a separate API call once you've added the front end. Also add the bind lines you want to it, which can be SSL or HTTP as per normal HAProxy configuration. So generally, if you're adding a front end, you'll do it in a transaction. So you can add the front end and then add bind lines, but you can do it individually as well.
Sure. Okay, this next question is in two parts. It's about making changes with the API. So when you make a change with the API, what happens to the configuration file on disk? Is it updated or overwritten? And the second part of this is, does this work when you're using a version controlled configuration file?
So for the first part, the configuration will be overwritten on disk. The data plane API should be watching the configuration unless you've disabled the iNotify feature. So whenever the configuration is changed on disk, so if you when you manually add a new configuration line or whatever it is that's been changed, it should print the data plane APIs will say reloading the configuration when it reloads it in memory. It won't actually change the HA proxy in any way. But then when you make a modification via the data plane API call, it will reload. It will then should use the latest changed version. If you're using a version control system, which is managing the configuration itself, if it's watching to see if the configuration file changes on disk, then it will pick up the changes to the that the data plane API has made. Otherwise, if it's just overwriting the configuration that the data plane API is reading, when the configuration in the version control is changed, you'll simply have nothing. The data plane API will just be a do nothing tool, which isn't terribly useful. There is a get endpoint in the data plane API, so you can tell HAProxy or the data plane API rather to check its configuration changes in, or you could have the version control system also use iNotify to watch and see when the config file changes and check that in, so that when the data plane API makes its changes, it also updates in the version control.
Excellent, quite thorough. We have a few more, so we'll see how many of these we can get to. Is there any plan to maintain a Go client for the data plane API?
There are not currently any clients for the data plane API. You can build using the specification, you can build a client, sort of a bare bones framework using the open spec, so you can do it that way. But as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to have official clients for the data plane API outside of curl, which is my favorite.
Yep. All right, going right down the line. What if I have a number of EC2 workers which host a set of different Docker containers? Does it mean that I need to tag these EC2 instances multiple times with different tags so that they end up in a proper HAProxy backend?
Could you repeat that question, please? I think I missed
Yeah, what
at
if
least part of it.
what if I have a number of EC2 workers which host a set of different Docker containers? Does it mean that I need to tag these EC2 instances multiple times with different tags so that they end up on a proper HAProxy backend?
Oh, okay. So each Docker container is running a service that HAProxy should load balance to, and so then in that case you probably would not want to use tagging of the containers or the EC2 instance itself, because if the EC2 instance is running multiple, unless you'd either have HAProxy running on the EC2 instance to additionally load balance to the various Docker containers inside of it, in which case you would just have the EC2 instance listed once, or you would want to address each Docker container individually rather than addressing the EC2 instance itself, in which case you'd probably want to use Consul or another tool, because you can't have a single EC2 container tagged multiple times. I do not believe will create multiple different IP addresses, one for your ports, one for each container. So you'd probably do that via Consul, or DNS service discovery or another method. So it depends on exactly how the container is exposing the Docker parts.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Okay, a default section sets default parameters for all other sections following its declaration. Those default parameters are reset by the next default section. Is it possible with the Data Plane API to specify where the default section should be created within the configuration?
It is not possible, and the Data Plane API itself does not support multiple default sections. It is assuming that basically everything is being created via the Data Plane API, and so the various arguments would mostly be specified. So the mode TCP would be set when you're creating a backend and that type of thing. So you generally would not need multiple default sections. If you do have multiple default sections, you cannot, and so accordingly, you also can't make multiple default sections with the Data Plane API. And if you feed the Data Plane API a configuration with multiple default sections, it will mungle them all together into a gigantic, horrible mess. So generally, if you have multiple default sections, you want to avoid telling the Data Plane API to modify them, or else it will do terrible things.
Got it. We have time for one more question. Are you setting up one Data Plane API endpoint per HAProxy service or server? Or can it be set up once on one endpoint affecting a suite of HAProxy servers on different servers?
So
Services on
if
different
you're
servers.
normally you would run one Data Plane API instance per HAProxy server, so that it modifies the local config, and then also use the socket to modify the status of the current Data Plane API. You can run a single Data Plane API instance. There's a configuration flag to not run for it to assume it is not running directly with the data plane, or that is not running directly with an HAProxy instance, so it won't try to modify the configuration over the socket. And if you do it that way, you can then just modify. You can basically use the Data Plane API as a tool to read, write, and modify a config file, and without any of the HAProxy specific parts. And if you're doing it that way, you would need a configuration deployment tool to watch the changes to the config and to deploy them manually, since the Data Plane API won't handle the deployment unless it's actually running on the instance itself.
Excellent. Okay, that's all the time we have for the Q&A today. So Chad, thank you so much for your talk and for participating in the live Q&A, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.